You're walking down the street at night, alone. You're just minding your business when you get that gut feeling in your stomach. You're not alone. And what's worse is that the figure that's just now coming into peripheral seems far from friendly. People around the world experience terrifying encounters just like this, and decide to share their experiences online in the hopes that others may benefit from them. Thank you to everyone that's allowed me to share their story. With that, to everyone, sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. This was several years ago now, when I was in college, and I was headed back to my apartment late one night after being out with friends. As I went out to make a left turn into the complex, I checked to see if anyone was behind me, and since no one was in front of me or behind me, I opted not to worry about using a turn signal. I parked outside my building, and as I was crossing the street to get to my apartment, a car was driving towards me. I wondered where it had come from, since I was sure no one was near me when I turned in. But I was only 18, very sheltered and naive. And instead of being cautious or fearful, instead wanted to be helpful. The car stopped approximately 16 feet or so away from me, as I was right in the middle of the street, and a man got out and asked, "Do you live here?" I thought maybe he needed directions, and I told him that I did live here. As he asked this, he was walking towards me, and as soon as I answered, he lunged at me and grabbed a handful of my hair in his right hand and grabbed my throat with his left hand and started dragging me to his car as he growled that he ought to cut my fucking neck. To say I was in shock was an understatement. His car was running with the door open, and it wasn't until I was at his car door before my brain literally used my name and said, "Caitlin, scream." Once I finally started screaming, he pushed me away while he jumped into his car and took off, and I ran to my apartment. I was shaking so badly, I could barely get the key into the lock, and once I was inside, I realized my boyfriend was there because he'd come by earlier the night to surprise me. But since I wasn't home, he'd gone to bed. Of course, I was still freaking out, but instead of him being concerned, he acted like an ass because he was upset I was coming in so late, so I didn't even call the police. Once I told my mom the next day, she insisted that I call them, but of course, nothing ever came of it. I often wondered what the guy thought I did, that I deserved to have my fucking neck cut. I'm sure it wasn't because I didn't use a turn signal, so I even wonder where he came from. I never wanted to meet him again, and I always hoped no one else did either. When I was 16 years old, I decided to surprise my parents with a bouquet of flowers for Valentine's Day. We've always celebrated this as a family holiday rather than a romantic one. I didn't have a car to drive to a florist, but my high school was within walking distance of a hospital, boasting a gift shop that sells floral arrangements. Between classes during the week of Valentine's Day, I set off for the hospital by my lonesome, cutting across campus to walk through a network of side roads populated with specialty doctors' offices that keep odd hours. The sorts of buildings where traveling doctors mainly hold surgery consultations or perform small procedures a few times a month. The trip there passed without incident. As I was walking back through said deserted roads with a vase of flowers in tow, I noticed an unkempt 1990s car close behind me. While my memory of the car is hazy, I am left with the impression that there was at least two men within those faces I could not see. Initially, I assumed that the driver was simply afraid of hitting me, the reason they weren't passing by, so I made a point of dramatically trudging further into the grassy shoulder of the road, demonstrating to them they could safely drive ahead. They still refused to pass me by, continuing to creep along behind at a slow pace. Beginning to suspect the driver was more interested in me than a destination, I began to walk faster. The car confirmed my suspicions by matching my speed. Despite the impracticality of my shoes and the threat of spilling water from my vase, I commenced to run as fast as I possibly could. They hit the gas and again matched my speed. I realized at this point that the car was following me, that there was no one in sight to notice, and I needed to get away. I bolted into the first parking lot that I saw. The car turned in after me. Despite there being only 2 or 3 cars in the spacious front parking lot, and there being no other sign of activity at the office, this car did not stop to park in the numerous spaces available there. The driver instead opted to pursue me into the partially under construction back portion of this lot, behind the office. It passed every available parking space to corner me against a pile of debris and rubble from the construction, coming to a diagonal stop less than 3 feet away. Before anyone could emerge from the vehicle, I somehow managed to scale the small prominence of rubble against my back, vase in hand, and jumped from its peak to land painfully on the other side, which fortunately was a plot of undeveloped land within sight of my high school campus. I took a quick peek over my shoulder to see if they were still in pursuit, but the car had sped off after I reached the top of the rubble pile and was now nowhere in sight. They had not parked in the lot at all. They had no business there. The driver was following me. I sprinted at top speed and didn't stop until I was soaked with sweat in the dead of winter and panting in the student lounge among my classmates, who didn't seem to give a damn when I told them. Possibly because our hometown is supposedly a human trafficking capital, and the crime rate is outrageous. Although I am convinced that this was something more informal than human trafficking, as the dilapidated car suggested poverty, and I have read human trafficking usually arises through grooming and not being snatched off of the streets. In retrospect, I should have told an adult, alerted campus security, and called the non-emergency line of the local police station. But I was young, foolish, insecure, and afraid of getting in trouble for leaving campus when I didn't have a signed permission slip form permitting me to do so. I kept trying to convince myself that I had misread the situation or was overreacting. I don't even know what I would have told the police had I called them, as I was entirely ignorant on the subject of cars and couldn't have identified the make of it had I been asked, and I couldn't see the faces of the occupants. I was also worried that my parents would restrict my already extremely limited freedoms if they knew I had been in any danger. I feel horrible for having never told anyone, and earnestly hope that my secrecy hasn't led to someone being hurt or killed. I believe the only missing people aside from runaway children or elderly adults with dementia in my city right now, though, are men, aside from one woman a few decades ago. So, whoever followed and tried to trap a 16-year-old girl with flowers at a doctor's office just before Valentine's Day of 2016, let's not meet. This happened to me when I was 21, after an OD suicide attempt. I woke up in the hospital in the middle of the night to a nurse saying he needed to replace my IV. He jabs me 2 or 3 times but doesn't hit a vein. So I ask if he could get someone else to try. He says no and keeps going. As he is doing this, he is pushing and wiggling the needles under my skin, saying he is trying to get the vein. By the 7th or 8th needle, it registers that he is intentionally trying to hurt me. I ask him, "Why are you doing this?" He just says, "It's your own fault you're here." I was too weak to fight back, and it was the middle of the night. There was no one else around I could call out to. I have no idea how many times he ended up puncturing me in the end, The next day, a different nurse was taking out my IV. She was horrified, because she said it was the biggest needle she'd ever seen used on a living patient. Not sure why you would use needles on a dead patient, but that's what she said. A lot of people shrug this off when I tell them about it. But it was so terrifying being alone, helpless, and knowing that the person who was supposed to care for you hated you and wanted to cause you pain. So yeah, night nurse who loves huge needles and hates mentally ill girls, let's not meet again. For those wondering, I am doing much, much better now. This happened 7 years ago and I didn't report it. Very small town, I was scared that people I worked with would find out about my suicide attempt if I pursued it. Plus, I was just focused on survival. To understand my story, you sort of have to know a tiny bit about trespassing laws in our country, and that we don't have any so long as you're respectful and non-destructive. You can walk over any hills you like, and in my case, camp on any beach of your choosing, so long as once you leave the area is how you found it. I used to love camping when I was little. Our family would go multiple times a year with a large group of my parents' friends and their kids. On average, there were maybe 10 of us at the time, which was a bit of a logistical challenge since we always headed out to this one really remote beach on the coast. Actually, we weren't the only ones. There were always yachts bobbing just off the shore with people in them, and other campers lining up and down the beach. Most of them also had children or teenagers, so it wasn't a wild party scene. It was very much an informal family holiday spot. There was even a small building with toilets and showers installed nearby, even though this was the middle of nowhere. I guess the local council must have figured it out and got sick of people peeing behind bushes. We took a trip up in spring 2011. I'm really bad with time, but I know this because I got my dog in winter 2010, after picking her out that November from the shelter as a birthday gift from me to me, as I had paid her adoption fee. Reddit. I know you love dogs, and she will be very important to the story later. So let me tell you a little bit about Parmesan. Parmesan came to me as a 6-month-old puppy who had been rescued from a dog fighting situation. We're not entirely sure what breed she is exactly, but my best guess is a lurcher/staffy mix. She is a wonderfully well-tempered dog, with people and most dogs. But you absolutely do not threaten her. She'll have you. So, by the time of this camping trip, I'd had Parmesan for a few months. She'd never come camping with us before, but far as my family are concerned, dogs go on camping trips. So when we all piled into the car, she came too. Unusually though, none of the family friends could make it. So it was only me, my sister, my dad, and my mom. I didn't mind. I wasn't that attached to the other kids. I'd rather play with my dog, and I'd still have my sister. The drive took the best part of 6 hours, and because we left a bit later, although I don't remember why we left later than normal, we arrived at sunset. Not a good time to be building a tent, but we'd expected to arrive to other campers already set up, and the beach illuminated in campfires. The beach was empty. In spite of this, my parents started taking stuff out and trying to build the tent. They asked us to fetch some of the lighter bags from the boot of the car, while they sat pointing a flashlight at the sand to see properly. I rolled down the window of the car for Parmesan before getting out. It was pretty hot for that time of year, and I wanted her to have air. Always gotta be looking out for my furry little homie. As we're fumbling about in the dark, on a beach, in the middle of nowhere, it's pretty spooky. The one road that led us to this beach was circular and had a bridge over the water, meaning you could basically circle around the beach like a big O shape if you felt like it. I wasn't really paying any attention to the road. I was complaining I was tired, as kids are wont to do, but my mom was paying attention herself. After maybe 15 minutes of my dad trying to nail the tent into the sand, my mom's asking him had he seen that car drive around. It's been a few times. My dad kinda shrugged her off. He's sort of like that. I don't know if he had said anything back to her, but after a few more minutes, a car pulled up next to ours on the road, and someone got out. It was maybe 15 or 20 feet from the cars to where we were, and the light was pretty low, except for the torches. We weren't expecting to see anyone else out here at this point, and I think my mom said it must be the security. I don't know why a random beach would have security. I think what she meant was the Wildlife Trust or something, as they do occasionally come down to do their nosy. The guy was walking pretty unevenly. He must have been drunk or high because he had that stagger to him. There was absolutely no way this guy was sober. Cool, a junkie. Not an unusual find, but it's rare to see them in the wild. As he walked into flashlight range, we realized he was carrying a large knife, maybe 15 inches. Although I was small at the time, so maybe my sense of scale was off. I don't like my dad, but credit to him, once he saw this, he got up immediately, holding on to the camping mallet and put us all behind him. The man began to shout wildly at us that we can't camp here and he was just letting us know. My dad tried to initially be a bit low-key with the guy and told him that was fine. We'd leave, but this didn't work. He kept coming closer to us. So my dad started shouting and the man kept shouting back. My sister and I were crying. I remember shaking. I was utterly terrified, as I'm sure anyone would be in that situation. It really did seem like this guy and my dad were going to fight, and I'm going to be honest. I didn't fancy my dad's chances. While it's grim to consider, I'm absolutely convinced he would have killed my dad, and possibly us as well once he was done, as I don't think my mother would have had the common sense to run with us. I love her, but she always puts dad and her relationship with him above us. This isn't how it went down. A bolt like a wolf descending on its prey took us all by surprise. Most of all the man with the knife. In that moment, Parmesan was the apex predator large canines represent in nature. She got him good by the arm and clamped down hard, ripping his jacket and shredding the skin underneath. He dropped the knife as it had been in the arm she had gotten him by. He kicked her, he punched her, and eventually got her off. He grabbed the knife from the sand and ran back to his car and drove off. Parmesan didn't follow him. She stayed with us, muzzle covered in blood. Quickly as we could, we gathered our things and all got back in the car, all pretty shook up by the incident. I looked Parmy over, she was okay, but the car's window was much more open than I'd left it. We think what happened was when the shouting started, she must have put her paws up on the gap I'd left for her. As it was an old car and had the rolly windows down, and not an electric button, we think she must have been able to hit with her paws to force it down enough to squeeze it out. This is not the end of my story. We were all pretty scared, and since we had the dog with us, we couldn't book into a hotel for the night. My parents decided just to drive home so we could all feel safe, but first had to drive into the nearest town for petrol as they were kind of low. I spent the time trying to clean Parmesan up a little. I'd always loved dogs, but what she'd just done for me blew my mind. As we drove into town, we came across a petrol station, but it looked closed. My dad drove up closer to get a better look and stuck his head out the window to get a better look at the sign. My mom asked him what on earth he was doing, and he told her he was trying to see when it opens. Never. My heart fucking sank. Parked in the corner, behind a van so we hadn't seen him at first, was the man with the knife. He was sitting on the bonnet of his car, using some tissue paper to clean up his arm. It looked pretty bad. Without stopping to refuel or look anywhere else in town, my dad drove right out of there. He decided to go to the next town over, but this was proving to be difficult. The next town was 60 miles away. He didn't have that much petrol, we realized as we began driving. We were going to break down. That's fine, Dad said. We had AA coverage. They'd come tow us home, or at least to somewhere acceptable for the night. Better than staying in the last town. After driving for maybe 5 minutes, lights flashed from us behind, another car. The same car the man had been driving. It was him following us. He must have realized we were low on petrol. The next half hour was one of the worst half hours of my life. I had a complete and utter breakdown, as did everyone really. I could tell my parents were trying to keep it under wraps so it wouldn't upset us, but we weren't really little kids. We were both double digits, and we knew how dangerous this situation was. Dad turned off the radio to conserve petrol, and the men followed us for 55 miles before he peeled away onto another road. Our fuel meter was on the big red E for empty for the last 10 miles. We were driving on fumes. I don't really believe in God, but if he does exist, that was definitely one of his miracles. Once we got there, we drove into a petrol station and refilled to a full tank before driving the rest of the way home. My sister and I slept in the car after that. I only woke up once we made it all the way home, just grateful nothing worse had happened that night. After getting some sleep, my mom phoned the non-emergency line for the police and reported what had happened. They never got back to her after that, but apparently the woman she spoke to said they may wish to in the future, as he matched the description given of a suspect wanted in relation to a murder charge. No idea if he actually was that guy or just a random psycho, as I said. They never got back to her. So what's the takeaway then? Other than crazy man on the beach, let's not meet. Well, for me, it's that I love Parmesan. She's still with us now, old as the hills and twice as grizzled, as one of my mom's friends likes to joke. I don't know why she did what she did that day. I couldn't tell you what her thought process was. What I do know is that this poor puppy was born into an environment where they abused and neglected her, only to be rescued and taken to a shelter where her mother and siblings all found homes before her. Despite how badly people had treated her, when I took her home, she forgave but never forgot. I think the saying is I never trust a person who doesn't like a dog, but I always trust a dog when they don't like a person. They have a very good understanding of human body language, and I think she must have understood how much danger we were in. If you're able to, please adopt. You might find yourself in a situation like mine one day. I promise you, if you're willing to save a four-legged animal's friend's life, they will pay you back tenfold if they're able to, without a thought for their own safety. I paid 78 euros for Parmesan's adoption fee, which is a lot when you're a kid, but it chills me to my bones knowing if I hadn't been so instant on a dog, I might be dead. I recently received a friend request that reminded me of this story, so I'm going to share it here. This happened after I went to university, so I was 18. I made an effort to make new friends after I moved onto campus, and ended up with a group of friends to hang out with, including a new girlfriend and plenty of people from my classes that I liked well enough. There was one class before lunch where it was traditional for people to go to the cafeteria afterwards, to eat in pairs or threes. I wasn't very discerning about who I'd have lunch with, because I got on fine with most people from the class, and we were all trying to make an effort to be social. So when one girl, Lily, asked if I wanted to eat lunch together after that class, I didn't have any reason not to go. We talked about school and that kind of thing, nothing noteworthy. but she did ask me to get lunch with her again the next week. It became a pattern, and there wasn't exactly a way to start saying no suddenly. It was fine, but it did mean I lost the chance to eat lunch with anyone else on those days. In hindsight, I suppose that was the point. One day in class, I asked someone if I could add them on social media. This happened in front of Lily. I saw her face jerk towards me from a couple of seats over. It was such a sharp reaction that it was hard to ignore, and I still remember it. By the time I got home later that day, Lily had sent me a friend request. No friends in common. Don't know how she knew my last name. I was a bit surprised, but I guess she just dug through the university's social media pages and found me through there. It just gave me a really bad feeling, but surely it was fine. She ended up messaging me a lot and commenting on anything I posted. I told myself that she was just awkward, and we became friends, if not close. I'd known worse people. She still always got me to go eat lunch with her after one of our shared classes. Other than that, we rarely spent time together in person. I saw her around sometimes, but I never went out of my way to hang out with her. So it was mostly online messaging and seeing each other in group settings. Coincidentally, my girlfriend was also called Lily. This was something that clearly bothered Lily, not my girlfriend, who couldn't have found it less interesting. It's a common name. She occasionally hinted that she wanted my girlfriend to pick a different name, or joked about her not suiting it. She clearly didn't like my girlfriend at all, and I had an idea of why. It was hard to ignore by this point. Lily was starting to unsubtly hint that she had a crush on me. I tried not to address it, because what was I going to say? I've never known what to do when a friend makes a pass at me. I was also not interested in the least, even ignoring the weird stuff she pulled. Lily was not my type at all. She tended to dress and act in a way somewhere between a 50s housewife and one of those adults who is still obsessed with Disney princesses, if you can picture that. Things took an uncomfortable turn on the day of our last shared class of the year. Instead of asking me to lunch like she usually did, Lily asked if I'd go for a walk with her. Again, I didn't exactly know how to refuse, so I said all right. Our campus was bordered by a large patch of woodland. Lily led me into the woods, and the sounds of our fellow students slowly faded away. She sat down on a log, and I joined her. She started talking about how she was going to miss me over the summer. I tried placating her, but I didn't want to be there, especially because she seemed almost on the verge of tears. I think I tried to make an excuse about having plans with my girlfriend, but before I could leave, Lily chose to kiss me without warning. It was uncomfortable to say the least. I got out of there and was happy to think I wouldn't see her for a while. I came back to university after the summer, moving into a house with my friends. Without going off topic, there were some serious issues in my friend group. A lot of petty arguing and worse. I broke up with my girlfriend around the start of that school year as well, and basically the whole mess made me recontextualize things with Lily, because it suddenly didn't seem as bad. That said, I didn't want to be alone with her. We mostly talked online. She was still constantly messaging me after all. One upside of everything was that I started dating a boy. Lily was not pleased to hear that news. I think she hoped to sneak in after I broke up with my girlfriend, but as I said before, that was never going to happen. There wasn't a big gap between my breakup and this new relationship, so she must have thought she missed her chance to be with me. This is where the story gets bad. At this time, I was fairly active on Tumblr. I occasionally talked about my life, and mostly reblogged photos and stuff. I was on there one day when something odd happened. One of the blogs I followed had received an ask with some phrases I recognized. It took a second to register that it was taken from my About page. That made me freeze. I read the message properly. Someone was asking this completely random person to analyze a section of text from my page, asking for their opinion on the type of person who would write it. I cannot stress how messed up it was to see people talking about me like I was a character in a book they were trying to study. The reply was basically, "I don't know, sorry." But the important thing was that the question hadn't been anonymous. It linked to someone's blog. Obviously, I wanted to know who had taken such a bizarre interest in me. As far as I knew, no one in real life other than my boyfriend knew about my page. Well, no prizes for guessing who was behind it. What I found was like a shrine. She was using a fake name, but I recognized Lily all over that thing. It was this cutesy pink and red page. There were a few posts about her interests, but most of the content was focused on her primary interest, me. Most of the posts were about me. There were accounts of things I'd done recently. He told me about such and such. He went to a nightclub recently, etc. As well as referencing to things from as far back as I'd known her. It was clear she'd been keeping tabs on me, both online and offline, gathering up every scrap of information she could about my life and hoarding it here in her collection. She talked about us eating lunch together and how special our dates had been to her, as if it was anything more than acquaintances getting food after class. She talked about the time she had forcibly kissed me in the woods, but she wrote it as if it had been mutual. She quoted lyrics from my favorite song and talked about how she'd always be there for me, no matter who else came into my life. Lots of references to loving me just the way he is, which answered another mystery about an anonymous love letter I'd received earlier that year with the same wording. It got worse. There were a lot of posts about my boyfriend as well. These weren't so nice. They got vicious, talking about how he didn't deserve me. He didn't know what he had. If she was with me, she'd be jealous of anyone else who came near me. So my boyfriend not being a jealous person meant he didn't love me. It was angry and hateful. I didn't like to think about the sort of person who could write so obsessively, being fixated on me. One thing that didn't make sense at first was that the blog almost made plenty of references to Lily's best friend, Steven. She had never mentioned this person to me. Her posts talked a lot about Steven and how great a friend he was, and how much fun they had together, how he looked out for her, etc. I was trying to work out whether this was an online friend, when one specific post made it all click. She posted a photo and captioned it with, "Steven sent this to me. He knew I would like it and I love it." Or something like that. The problem was the photo was taken from my own page. I hadn't sent it to her. She took it from my page and then claimed this fictional best friend of hers shared it with her, because in her head, she'd split me into two people. In her messed up fantasy life, I was both the perfect best friend who was always looking out for her, and her soulmate who was bound to end up with her when I finally got over my sweet, kind boyfriend and all that other easy girls I hung out with that she made dozens of posts complaining about. Who was she complaining to? Oh, Lily had an audience. She asked open questions about me and her relationship with me, and got messages back from her followers. People who took what she said at face value. I saw a bunch of people agreeing with this stalker, that my boyfriend didn't deserve me, and we were bound to break up soon so I could be with Lily, the person I was clearly supposed to be with. She had this fake fanfiction version of my life up for anyone to share their opinion on, and she'd made herself out to be the hero of it all. I went maybe a month back into this page's history. I did not look at everything that was there, it was too much. So I'm not sure how long this had been going on. I sent Lily a message confronting her about the blog. She said nothing. And I cannot stress how weird it was to have found pages and pages dedicated to me, with her talking about how she was in love with me and would make sure we ended up together, slamming my boyfriend and building a fantasy life with 2 different versions of me in it that she clearly believed to be real. Then acting like it hadn't happened. She said nothing. She didn't address it, she just changed the subject. Even after I pushed, and it was like she hadn't even registered what I said. I've never seen anything else like it. She deleted the page, of course, or at least changed the name and hid it so I never found it again. It wasn't the end though. I wasn't going to hang out with her anymore, but we were still shoved together in classes, and she had started to actually scare me with what she might do next. I'm kind of a paranoid person. Knowing someone was obsessively keeping track of me for who knows how long freaked me out. The next thing she pulled was trying to seduce my boyfriend. It was an absolutely useless attempt that only made him uncomfortable. He told me about it right away. What was her plan there? Did she hope to tell me he cheated and wait for me to break up with him? Why would I want her after that? When that didn't work out for her, she tried hitting on 3 of my other friends. None of them took the bait. She ended up dating one of my former housemates for a while, but made sure to send me messages while they were together, letting me know she'd rather be with me. No thanks. Lily made sure to stay in my life the whole time I was at university. There was a time when I tried to pull away from her, and she ended up starting rumors about me and damaging a career opportunity I'd put a lot of work into. I don't know what else she did behind my back, but it made me realize it was safer to let her think she was a part of my life while ignoring her, rather than doing something that would cause her to get angry. After I graduated, Lily still wanted to spend time together, but I knew I didn't have to now. I made excuses about work and barely talked to her after that point. I almost entirely stopped posting on social media that I knew she knew about. Of course, she didn't give up that easily. She tried to start conversations, asked me to meet up with her, attempts I usually ignored. I didn't like to think that she was still tracking me online, but she probably was. I don't know how, but she'd occasionally reference things I mentioned online somewhere she shouldn't have known about. The last time we had a real conversation, she sent me a message out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken at all in months, and we hadn't talked about anything serious in much longer than that. Thinking about that conversation still makes my skin crawl, but I'll summarize what happened. At first, she asked me some questions about how long I had known I was queer. I told her some basic stuff, the kind of thing I'd tell anyone who asked. Then she changed the subject. She started talking about how would I feel about her if she was a boy, about wanting to be a boy for me. The messages quickly became fetishistic. She went into plenty of detail about fantasies she had of the 2 of us. Again, we were not friends at this point. We'd never been especially close, at least not from my perspective, and we had barely spoken for years. I can't imagine sending messages like that to even a close friend, let alone someone who barely knows you. I tried telling her not to pull this crap with me, but she decided to change tactics She sent photos of herself, followed by a bunch of messages, maybe 4 or 5 a minute. Way too fast for me to reply before the next one arrived. Basically quoting back what I told her about myself and my past earlier. She was telling me these things as if they had happened to her. She was role-playing as me. The worst part was that she seemed to believe it was real. That those things actually had happened to her. Even when she was quoting me word for word. Things I told her only hours before were now her life. It was like she was trying to absorb my history, to take it over, to make my life a part of hers. Yeah, I didn't talk to her again after that. I ignored future attempts she made to talk to me, and I eventually silently deleted her from the inactive social media, which was her only real way of contacting me. I really thought she might finally move on. A few days ago, she sent me a friend request. It's sitting there unanswered, because I know if I delete it, she'll only send another one. Lily and I met nearly 12 years ago. This story is just the highlights, and even then, it's only the stuff I know about for sure. A lot happened behind my back. I know it did. So, girl who spent 12 years obsessing over me, fetishizing me, stalking me, and harassing me. Let's not meet again. The fantasy life you built for the two of us in your head is the only place you'll be seeing me anytime soon. This story takes place in November of 2017. I was 18. I'm a very short girl, only about 4'10", and I get anxious when someone even looks at me in a way to suggest they might not like me. So needless to say, I'm incredibly non-confrontational. My friend and I were out shopping. It was something we do maybe every few months just to bond, since we didn't have much time to hang out due to college. She's just like me, barely scraped 5'1" and very non-confrontational. It's probably why we became friends. On every shopping trip we would find ourselves in Ann Summers. We're both overly endowed and struggled to find bras anywhere to use. And Ann Summers always had great sales, so we'd grab at the cheap bras while we could. This shopping trip wasn't any different. We browsed shops until we got to Ann Summers. But that's when things took a bit of a turn. I'd barely stepped foot into the shop when a woman with some sort of Slavic accent stopped me. Her finger jammed into my chest. "Spit the gum out," she demanded. Assuming she was an employee, I gave a very sheepish "I'm really sorry," and ran out of the shop to spit the gum out and throw it away. When I went back in, I realized that this woman was not an employee. She was a customer who was browsing and happened to be near the door when my friend and I entered the shop. It should have been obvious to me at the time. No salesperson would behave like that. Not one that wanted to keep their job anyway. But I kept my head down when I walked past her, holding my breath in hopes she wouldn't notice me again. She didn't, and I thought I was in the clear. My friend and I browsed the shop, trying to avoid the woman. But the shop wasn't very big, probably only 15 feet by about 18 feet. So eventually I ended up at the sales stand by the door where she had been stood. I tried to keep my distance while browsing. I was looking at the price tags, but realized I didn't know what the discount was, so I leaned over slyly to check the discount sign. It's important to note that this woman had a pushchair, which is a stroller for the Americans. You'd think that she maybe had a child in this pushchair, but no. It was full of plastic carrier bags. I didn't look too much at it, but I could tell that everything in there was double bagged and tied shut. Whatever was in those bags, she wanted to protect. This sense of protection became very relevant. because when I leaned over to look at the discount sign, I was leaning slightly close to her pushchair. It was still about 3 feet away, but apparently this was too close. The woman was on the other side of the chair, but the moment she saw me, she ran around it to where I stood. She hit me in the face. It was somewhere between a slap and a punch. I couldn't quite tell because I was in shock. All I knew is that it hurt. "Watch the personal space," she hissed in my ear. I apologized to her. This woman just hit me and I apologized to her. I regret it now, but at the time I didn't want to provoke her any further. Not that I knew what I did to provoke her in the first place. I turned around and ran to the back area, grabbing my friend's hand and pulling her with me. The back area was separated by a tiny wall that only stretched halfway across the shop, since they stored the adult toys there and wanted to keep them out of sight of the general public. I stood there holding my friend's hand and shaking as I whispered, "She just hit me," to my friend. We stood there for a good minute in silence. My friend was positioned in a way that she could see the rest of the store, while I hid behind the wall. "She's gone," my friend told me. I let out a breath that I didn't know I was holding. "Can we just stay in here for a while?" I asked my friend, worried that the woman would be outside waiting for me. The front of the store was open, but she could have easily just been a couple of feet down the road and out of sight, waiting for me to leave. My friend agreed and we slowly browsed the shop again. About 5 minutes later, we got to the counter to check out. The girl working the counter looked outside and then back at us. "That woman has been in here for 30 minutes. I didn't know what to do," she told the two of us. "What did she say to you?" "She told me to spit out my gum when we first came in, and then she hit me because I was too close to her," I told her. "She hit you?" The worker was wide-eyed. "If I had known that, I would have called security. I'm so sorry." I smiled and shrugged. "It's fine." It wasn't really fine, but it wasn't the worker's fault. She didn't look much older than me, and I wouldn't have known what to do in that situation either. Still shaken up, my friend and I made our way out of the store. I looked around but didn't see the woman. "Can we go home now?" I asked my friend. We hadn't finished browsing all of the shops, but I was so paranoid that we bump into the woman again. She agreed and we got the bus home. When I got home, my parents encouraged me to report this incident to the police. I called the non-emergency line and their answer was basically, "Well, what do you expect us to do about it?" Unless I went back to the Ann Summers and requested the security footage, which I wasn't sure if they actually had, they wouldn't do anything. It's been just over 3 years now. I'm sure that the woman was likely to have been homeless and or on drugs. It's the only explanation I can think of for the carrier bags and her protectiveness. It was either everything she owned or drugs, or both. So to the possibly homeless, possibly drugged up woman who hit me, I hope that the current state of the world is treating you well, and you're finally getting the personal space you wanted. But let's not meet again. This all took place 2 years ago, not too long after I moved to LA from Michigan. Because of this event, I learned a lot about advocating mental illness and stigma, which I now do on a regular basis, IRL and online. Mind you that this was written from the before perspective, explaining that we can't assume anything about someone regardless of beauty, stature, wealth, or appearance of it, etc., etc. It is important to be kind. Also, nowhere in there did I diagnose anyone. I am not entitled to do this because that is not my place. The word affliction should carry a neutral connotation and definition. Anyways, one afternoon, I walked to my local corner store for some smokes. About a 7-minute walk if you're really taking your time. As I was exiting the store, a woman approached me and politely asked for a cigarette. She was gorgeous. Super short hair, looked a lot like the woman who played Claire Underwood from House of Cards. Super lean, great shape, well kempt. Couldn't be older than early 40s. Regular clothes, basically a white tank top and jeans and regular shoes. People who are homeless don't always look dirty, but my immediate impression based off of her mannerisms was that she was just taking a break from a walk or something. It was really hot outside. I live in Los Angeles County. So I obliged, and after she handed my lighter back to me, her smile suddenly disappears, and she gets really, it's like she flipped a switch, and the polite smiling woman disappeared. It felt like her eyes got dark, like she disassociated. She took a drag and looked me in the face. Do you know what the fuck is going on too, or no? I had no idea what she meant, so I shook my head. There was that really mean smirk as she said, "Oh, so you're a dumb bitch too, huh?" I swear to fucking God, these fucking slurs moved into our land, took our jobs. No fucking joke, she deadass said it. "You're Trejo, aren't you?" I was completely shocked by this, because it was a nonsensical question. I thought it was a joke, but I could tell that it just couldn't have been. It felt as if she would have attacked me if I even replied, so I didn't respond at all. She seemed to lose perception of me while she started monologuing. It was getting more aggressive, so I managed to slowly walk away while she started raising her voice to say really horrible shit to no one. Most of it was racist, and I knew she wasn't talking to me exactly, but her eyes would dart back to me. I can't explain it well. I remember getting the goosebumps and immediately felt like running. Just sudden maximum adrenaline. I kept my cool and walked along the sidewalk of the busier road, so there would be witnesses if I happened to be attacked or something. Thankfully, she didn't follow. This wasn't the only time. It felt like she was either waiting around for me or something, because I ran into her multiple times over the entire year of 2019. 2 of them being at the same corner store again. The second time was at a McDonald's on the other corner. I was baked as shit, eating that good, and everyone reacts to a woman crying loudly from a booth that was a few tables behind me. Dread. I don't know how, but I just knew. I couldn't bring myself to look. A manager approached her, and after asking if the woman was okay, the woman replied with, "Do I look fucking okay to you?" and just kind of went off. The manager threatened to call the cops, and I just tried to keep my eyes down. As she passed me right before leaving, like literally her hand pushing the door open, she backs up and glares directly at me. Hey, fucking look at me. Y'all, this woman, she radiated wrath. Mama didn't raise no bitch, but I'm not fearless. For the first time in a very long time, I was actually terrified to death of another person. I looked up and she asked my name. "Hi, I'm OP." She responded with, "You're full of shit. You're Danny, aren't you? Is that you, Trejo?" I tried to assure her that I was not in fact Danny Trejo, and apologized for being unable to help her find him. She then said, "Well, next time you see him, tell him to go fuck himself," flipped me the bird, and left. The employees checked on me, but I stayed in that McDonald's for an extra hour just to be safe. I had my roommate pick me up and drive me home since I walked. It was less than a 10-minute walk in broad daylight. I just couldn't find the strength to do it, and my body felt so weak and shaky anyway. I hadn't cried about being afraid of another person in over 10 years. Being so afraid of someone who was potentially my neighbor. someone who might be following me. I saw her in passing at least once a week that year, until I got too scared to leave my home. We were complete strangers, and I didn't do anything to her except bum her a cigarette. The final time I ran into her was at the corner store again, month 5 or 6 of running into her. She was wearing really nice satin or silk pajamas, clean white fuzzy slippers, and had a cigarette in her hand. She saw me walking down the sidewalk, and I didn't have a choice but to look down and pass her. I ended up looking up and gave her a weak smile, like a just passing through. Kinda softer than the hello coworker scrunched face, you know. She still looked so evil, and I saw that she watched as I rounded the corner. I fucking bolted. Sprinting home takes less than a few minutes, but it felt like forever. I couldn't bring myself to go to the corner store for months after that, especially by myself. Despite having lived in the area for 3 years and befriending the clerks. My neighborhood isn't even a high crime area, and I never felt unsafe until that happened. Just a note, from one afflicted about another, this story is not meant to find actual humor out of those with illness or trauma or addiction. As absurd as it was, this woman has an affliction that somehow convinced her that I'm an actual enemy, in a way that made me feel legitimately threatened. I haven't seen her in a year, thankfully, and I hope she found some kind of help. Afflicted Claire Underwood lookalike, I'm sorry for whatever you've been through, but I really hope we never ever meet again. And if we do, I hope that you'll be well enough to see that I'm actually 28 years old and female, and very, very white. I consider most of 1996 to be a rebuilding year in my life. I was 25 years old, fresh out of a relationship that crashed and burned right before the wedding. So deep was the crater and widespread fallout that I had to move to an entirely different state to avoid my to-be father-in-law's friends in law enforcement, who were making sure I spent time roadside with them at least 4 times in the first 2 months after it all ended. I started over in a new place, with a lack of resources and connections that were going to make it hard to get back into shape before I turned 30. Still, I was free and beholden to no one but my creditors, so I had that going for me. I lived in my means and rented a townhouse in a long row of properties in a less than reputable part of town. I didn't have time to do a walkthrough before I moved in. In fact, I rented the place unseen based on the online ad. It was close to the job, which was great because someone trashed my car the week before I moved out, and I ended up driving a beat-up Dodge pickup that I bought with the last of my savings. Once settled, I was locked into the rental for 12 months, which oddly enough gave me a sense of permanence in my new surroundings, and helped me get to work on my new life and career in human capital management and training services. My unit was at the end of the block of 12, with 2 bedrooms up top with a master bath and a half bath in the living area. It was not a massive space, but it felt empty for the lack of any furniture. I slept on an inflatable mattress for my first 3 months, and used folding chairs and a card table to eat and watch television. The block was a place where people were either on their way up or back down. Young kids in their first home, recently divorced with kids, the downturned from society in one way or another. There were fights, domestic and otherwise, throughout the night. Drunken parties and birthday galas took over the block on weekends. But nobody ever interacted with other families for some reason. No one knew anyone else's names or business. At least that's what the cops told me the first time they stopped by, to ask me if I heard or witnessed something going on in the block. My immediate neighbors were just weird. Like a space monkey on your lawn inviting you to an anal probe kind of weird. It was a circus of 3. The short, wild-haired woman looked like an off-brand troll doll with big pink hair that defied logic and a malfunctioning soundboard that only shrieked when provoked. The tall, thin man looked like an average bald human might appear in an elongating funhouse mirror. I don't know how old they were, but they resembled old, well-worn furniture, like the contents of an elderly couple's storage locker, old and ready to be discarded. Troll doll lady and funhouse man were not fond of talking to neighbors, or anyone. They were troubled people. Their fights would bleed through the shared walls and get louder when talking outside. They knocked my only hanging art from the wall when one threw the other against the other side. Funhouse man liked to take his morning coffee in the sunshine, standing behind the screen of his front door in tidy whities and an oversized flannel shirt. He was often the first person I'd encounter in my morning, on my way to work, and he would just stare off across the playground into the woods, as if in a trance long before I left the townhouse, and probably long after my truck took me away. The cops knew them by their names. There had been a child living there, but he or she had been removed from the home. A frequent guest in their little David Lynch sitcom world was a guy named Chuck. So named because Troll Doll Lady would yell his name every 10 fucking minutes, anytime he was in the house. Chuck was a long-haul trucker who parked his sleeper rig across the street every couple of weeks. For some reason, he didn't shower inside. So Saturday mornings, he would often run the garden hose over the fenced-in area in the back to take a cold shower, which was a lovely sight the first time I didn't know what was going on. He sometimes walked out back to take a long beer piss in the runoff drain. His aversion to indoor plumbing was never explained to me, but I am forever grateful I never walked out back to catch him popping a squat in the tree line. For about 6 months, I tolerated the noise. Let the neighbors be the bad guys and call the police when the fight went too loud for too long, or when they all got drunk and played their 80s punk records through the night, and engaged in the song of their people howling at the moon. I got to a place where I was making enough money to buy a real furniture or rent a better place. I still had a lease to honor, so I bought a sofa, a real bed, and a desk set up for an office. It was a minimalist affair, but comfortable. The townhouse felt like my home for once, and suddenly the intrusions from the neighbors were twice as annoying. One night, Troll Doll Lady got into a fight with a pizza delivery driver who knocked on her door by mistake but wouldn't give her the pizza. I only know this because the pizza and its box hit my front window at different spots. This shrinking, pink-haired witch assaulted the driver, which led to a light show by police that rivaled a Mannheim Steamroller Christmas show. I was left to clean the pizza off of the window and call the police to replace it. They refused until the neighbors agreed to pay, so I enjoyed a cracked window for a month before the court accepted her guilty plea over the property damage. Her arrest was around the same time residents on our block and the next one over began reporting burglaries, and I was asked by police if I had any information or experienced anything odd, other than the 3 Geek circus next door. I told them I did not. Fortunately, my work and social life were on the rebound. I met a girl and we hit it off, though we stayed far from my house during the early part of our relationship. So I began spending more time away from home, though I would often come home late to the neighbors in a loud state of either bliss or rage. During the day, maintenance worked to replace the insulation and update the HVAC system along the attic spaces along the entire block. I didn't think much about it, because the work was done while I was gone in the daytime, and I assumed the property managers would be coming into my place at some point to access my attic. Probably the last one, as they started on the far end from mine. Quickly, I lost track of the project. One night I came home and something felt a little off. The front door was locked, the windows intact, and the back door secured. However, it felt and even smelled a little off. Sometimes I could smell the tobacco and weed upstairs when it filtered up and over the attic space, but I was sure someone had been there. I cleared the house in a short, quiet march, as my dad, a Marine, taught me, but found no one and nothing missing. My computer, 2 TVs, and everything was intact. Except, I went to grab a beer from the fridge to calm my nerves, and found a 6-pack missing. I was sure I had 2 scratch batch stout packs from my last visit to Stewie's microbrew. The loaf of bread seemed to be a little shorter than the morning before, by several slices. I couldn't be sure, but I thought I might be missing some other items as well, but wasn't sure if it was just the growing anxiety over being robbed. I wondered if maintenance had been by to inspect the window, or work in the attic and help themselves to a snack and drinks. It would explain the musty smell in my apartment, and given the people I knew who owned and managed the property, it would not surprise me if a couple of their day laborers took a load off for a bit. The smell was most present upstairs, but in my office, which was opposite the neighbor's wall, so it wasn't lingering dank. It was clearly gym funk. I immediately assumed a laborer because it made the most sense, so I didn't report it to police that night. The next morning, however, I discovered my medications missing from my cabinet. All of them. My Lexapro, my emergency anxiety meds, and my other bottles were gone. I checked the windows and doors again, now in a near panic. I called off work for the first time, using a burglary as my excuse. I was the 7th house in 2 townhouse blocks to be hit in the past 2 weeks, the 5th in my block, and one of the 5 without signs of forced entry. The police wouldn't tell me much about the other incidents, and didn't seem to believe that I locked my doors until I reminded them who I lived next to. By that point, I really didn't want to live in that place anymore. It no longer felt like home. I was sharing it with something I felt lingering in the air around me. There was a feeling of dread, a sense of violation knowing there was someone out there who was inside your life without permission. Once removed, it feels like living in a house without walls. And there was a serial burglar in a neighborhood where the cops traditionally left to work out its own problems and carry away the remains. A week after the break-in, a few things happened to fuck my world up even further. First, Troll Doll Lady returned home and, because she was on house arrest, a welcome party brought out all the freaks Friday night. Second, because I was a dumbass, I had to come home and pick up a few things I needed to spend the weekend with my new girlfriend. As she was already in the truck and we were about to be on the highway and out of town, there was no other choice but to bring her home with me. The lot, including my spaces, were filled with what looks like a gridlock in a demolition derby, so I had to park a good distance away. Third, she insisted on seeing the inside of my townhouse and take a pee before hitting the road, so I had to introduce her to the freak show next door before even setting foot inside. Fourth, on the way up to the walk to the front door, we encountered Funhouse Man in the open doorway, gatekeeper to the drunk dumbassery inside. He was wearing his morning apparel, briefs and a long shirt except with a can of Red Dog instead of coffee in his hand. Fifth, Funhouse Man looked at us coming up the walk and spoke to me for the first time in 7 months. "You tapped dat?" I think he said, his wet mouth spitting the words and his dead eyes scoping my girl. I shifted to put myself between them on the walk as we closed in on the door and fished my keys out of my pants. Funhouse Man panicked, letting out a squeal before diving inside and slamming the door. The party went silent instantly. Sixth, my girl was unnerved by this and lost all of her thrill over being with me in that place. She walked inside my home and registered her immediate disapproval. She didn't even want to pee there. I remember making some excuses, saying it's a temporary thing and the first step to better living, etc. But it was the beginning of the end for us. Like she caught me cheating with Troll Doll Lady. 7th, I didn't realize the party had spilled out into the front lawn and in front of my townhouse until I opened the door to see Chuck, the trucker, standing under my porch lamp looking drunk, stupid, and angry. He was joined by a few strangers who looked equal parts the same condition, and also like I had just fired the lot of them from the sideshow. I stopped inside the screen door, trying to think of anything to say, clever or otherwise. Chuck the trucker started the conversation. "You go at Kenny?" "What?" "Shit for brains. I asked if you went after Kenny in his own home." Nothing like that had happened, but I knew immediately that my reality was not shared by those gathered in front of my own home. "No," he said something. I got closer to hear. He squealed like a little girl and ran inside. End of story. I was okay at the end of the first 2 sentences, but my anger got the best of me by the start of the 3rd. And it did little to calm the group, which had swollen to about a dozen people, looking for blood or things to break. Chuck was not convinced by my answer, and took a step forward to open my screen door. He put a hand on the knob and stopped. "You step out here, or I come in there." "Go take a shit in a tree, asshole. You're not coming in here and I'm not bleeding over that weirdo friend of yours. You can go beat each other up like you normally." 8th. The word stopped there because Chuck had punched a hole in my screen to get in my face. I fell back and accidentally tackled my now firmly ex-girlfriend. Fortunately, I didn't have much in the way of furniture to break on the way down. The only thing going for me at that moment was the miraculous arrival of police drawn by the parking fiasco and the noise. My face was broken. My newest ex had a bloody nose and a sprained shoulder. And I was out a good $400 in deposits for a weekend that would never happen. In short order, a few important things happened. Chuck went to jail and the charges against him would become the least of his problems. The party turned into a story time where partygoers spend their best yarn about how I assaulted, beat, or ass-raped Kenny, the funhouse man. I was questioned about the encounter by police, and spent time with an EMT who I totally failed to impress enough to get her number. I was let go as several of the partygoers were arrested for either public drunkenness, disorderly conduct, or outstanding warrants. I'm sure this warmed me to the neighbors and their friends. My weekend companion was rescued from it all by a friend who drove her out of my life forever. You would think 8 things in short order would be enough. I had to continue living next to these fuck-ups for at least 4 more months, and I was going to spend those months terrified by what they might do to my property while I was working or the burglars coming back. However, 9th. I woke the next morning to the neighbors cleaning up from the party. Glass and aluminum, plastic and cardboard, packed 2 full-size bins. Credit where it's due, the fuckers recycled. From my what the fuck position in my bedroom window, I noticed 2 of the bottles stood out from the Keystone, Red Dog and Milwaukee labels. They were the scratch batch labels from my 6-pack. Now there was a chance that they were brought to the party by a guest, with better taste in beer than friends. But that was too much of a coincidence. My brain presented a question I could not answer. Where is the attic access in this townhouse? I just assumed there was one somewhere, but never actually looked or came across it. So how did maintenance get into it? While totally unrelated to the beer bottle on a conscious level, my paranoia and cynical nature collaborated on a series of connections. As I looked around the house for a drop that I'd missed for months, My brain worked in its weird way to line up facts in such a way that would sound insane if I wrote it all out. I went upstairs. My office was where the funk smell had been most pungent. I looked around again and decided to check the closet. I didn't check it before because there was nothing in it. On the carpet, I noticed a light dusting of drywall and paint flecks. I assumed it was from rubbing the sliding doors against the wall, but it concentrated at the side by the wall and not equally along the track. The closet only had hanging shelves on the interior side. Looking up, I expected to see an attic access port, but found a jagged square carved into the drywall ceiling. Maintenance was not exactly flip this shack quality, but I didn't think even they would use a box cutter to carve a hole in my ceiling, and none of them were skinny enough to fit through that. Funhouse Man was skinny enough to potentially weasel up and down. The scuff mark on the inside wall of the closet was pretty telling. It took a while for the police to make their way over in response to my non-emergency call, but it quickly gathered their interest when the first responding officer reported what everyone missed the first time they did a half-assed search of my home. 3 unmarked cars arrived after the initial squad car. My neighbors were uncharacteristically quiet once the first cruiser rolled up around noon. I offered a folding ladder and the police looked up into the blistering hot attic. A hole had been cut through the insulation, and a spot in the corner wide enough for a small or slender person to fit. I was questioned again downstairs for about an hour, before I heard more voices upstairs than I remember going up there. Before I could ask, a familiar face appeared at my door. My landlord, Ahmed, looked concerned and astonished, which was a new expression, and the third after his "can I take your money" and his general resting fuck off face. "What has happened?" he asked. "What is going on? Are you all right?" He walked into my home without invitation and up to me on my sofa. I asked him if he was there to fix my cracked window. Everything else happened without my direct involvement. I remained a guest in my own home for most of the day, as police took photos and marched up and down my stairs. I learned that my assumption about the attic work was wrong, that workers had to access specific units to get around the firewalls between them. In fact, there were holes in the firewall that allowed workers to enter the roof in one unit and run the entire length of the building. It was a measure that saved time and footsteps, but was a violation of several laws and codes, meaning that Ahmed's life was about to become much more complicated and expensive. These gaps in the firewalls also allowed someone to drill a hole into their ceiling and run the length of 11 other homes, walking on the same boards laid by the property owners that muffled their presence. Every single unit in that block had a hole similar to the one in my ceiling. Further, at one time, the building had been wired for cable through the roof, and holes that had been cut to fish cable into the upstairs bedrooms had been plugged up years earlier, during an upgrade. Some of those patches had been replaced with removable plugs, giving someone a clear view into various bedrooms. In the attic, police found a step stool with a rope tied to the top step. It was stashed in the corner of the roof over my next door neighbor's unit. But that's not the weirdest thing. Though all evidence pointed to the main access point being the smaller bedroom in my neighbor's unit, police did not arrest Funhouse Man or Troll Doll Lady for the crime. Around 3 in the afternoon, police had recovered items stolen from other units, along with various controlled substances. The Troll Doll Lady was arrested for violating the terms of her bond. Funhouse Man was taken in for the drugs. I was shocked to see a third person, not Chuck, walked out of the townhouse in cuffs. I'd never met him before. He was rail thin, thinner than Funhouse Man by half, an old man's face in a young man's body, with scars and bruises all over skin that I've only ever seen in corpses, white and waxy. He was naked except for soiled basketball shorts. He literally recoiled as if allergic to outside air and sun. and had to be dragged shoeless to the cruiser. I don't know who that kid was, but I got the feeling he never left the townhouse, ever. Maybe not even the attic. The thought that this skeletal creep was looking in on me and had access to my life makes me overly cautious these days. I have eyes everywhere in my home, and I take pains to inspect the smallest spaces in and around my property. I often wake in the night seeing that face peering at me through a window or from the dark. It's been a long time, and everyone I mentioned in the story by name is dead. I don't know about the kid, though. I never got a name, and I was unable to find him in any police record. Maybe he doesn't really exist. Maybe he didn't show up on any records and is languishing in prison as John Doe. Or maybe he's out there lurking in some upper level of an apartment building, or hiding inside the basement or walls. I've rarely ever felt truly home since. Let me start off by saying I know how terribly dumb and naive I was for letting myself get into this situation. Hell, sometimes I even laugh at how preposterous this whole thing was. And you can too. It is kind of funny at parts. However, at the time I knew if I'd been just a little dumber, I might have not been so lucky. And no, I do not have a foot fetish myself. It had all started a couple of years ago. I was a sophomore in high school, 15 or 16 at the time, and I was hanging out with extremely toxic and emotionally manipulative acquaintance Holly, who, let's just say, weren't shy on getting money from lucrative ways. Such ways included scamming older men for their money from fake dating profiles she made of other girls in our grade she didn't like, stealing from her parents and bumming off of money and things from her other friends. She had been doing this for years, same age as Carter and I was a minor at the time. Sure, we could have been considered friends, but I was much closer to my best friend Carter. Carter had been best friends with Holly since freshman year, and honestly, the only reason I hung out with her was because Carter insisted on inviting her to our hangouts every time. Holly was not a good person, and I quietly put up with her antics. One day, she starts talking about her friend Sarah. Awesome, but honestly, I really didn't care, especially knowing Carter and her ditched me for her. I wasn't really paying attention to the story until Holly asked me if I wanted to sell my socks for money. What the fuck? She smiles and proceeds to tell me how they found a super senior, kid you not, who bought knee-high socks for $90. All Sarah had to do was wear them outside for an entire day. Yeah, the freak liked them sweaty, I guess. The only thing was, the super senior insisted on meeting in person only. Holly laughed, telling me it was a little weird. Okay, red flag number 1. Holly never thought things were weird, unless they were really fucking weird. Then she proceeds to tell me that this super senior, honestly I never got his name so I'll just call him Kyle, was trying to get her in his house the entire time, but finally gave up and they left. You're probably thinking, what the hell? Who would be dumb enough to try to wrangle money from this freak? Me. I'm the idiot. All I really heard was $90 for a pair of old worn socks. I was in. Being the amazing friends they were, Holly and Carter just laughed and informed me that I would have to do it on my own, since they had better things to do, whatever they meant. They gave me his Instagram handle and wished me luck. Well, we had a problem right off the bat. You see, I had totaled my car just around a month before, and had no vehicle of my own. American and small towns, so it was hard to get around without a car. Well, being the dumbass that I was, and still am, I decided, hey, Let's just take my mom's car. Huge mistake. So I start messaging this Kyle on Instagram, explaining my situation and how I got in contact with him. I can't remember most of the conversation, but I can remember the guy being really insistent on meeting at his apartment complex. Red flag number 2. Although I'm very stupid and naive at times, I at least had some common sense. I brushed it off and suggested other local areas, Starbucks parking lot, local park, etc. But this guy wasn't backing down. Finally, after much convincing, I get Kyle to agree to meet in a nearby park, right by his house. Red flag number 3. So I convince my mom to allow me to drive her car, and I meet up with Kyle at the park. It's mostly deserted, but it's by a busy street, so I don't feel too uncomfortable. That's when I meet Kyle. He was a huge, fat, sweaty guy with a beard who reeked to high hell. Think neckbeard. My guy was at least 19, but looked like he could be pushing mid-20s. That's when I knew I made a mistake, but there was no way I was going to say no to $90. I awkwardly greeted him and formal pleasantries were exchanged. I don't remember much of the weird-ass conversation other than a couple of highlights. Number 1. The dude brought fucking rope. Turns out he was into bounding feet as well, and I was super creeped out. Dude then starts to tie my feet together after I mumbled a weak agreement. All I remember is staring at the sun, wishing I would die right there and then. Number 2. This guy had the gall to call my feet ugly while rubbing and massaging them. That kinda hurt, not going to lie. Number 3. Dude was insistent, almost straight up begging on showing me his knife collection back at home, and he said he would pay me extra to come with him. Yeah, no, that wasn't going to happen. I knew what that meant, and my virgin ass wanted no part in that. Highlights continued. Number 4. Dude straight up sniffed my socks after I gave them to him. No shame whatsoever. Told me he liked the vinegar smell. Yeah. Turns out the socks used to belong to my now deceased grandfather. I had just grabbed a random knee-high pair from my sock drawer. Number 5. After refusing Kyle multiple times to come back to his house, he only gave me 1/3 of the price we agreed on since I refused to come home with him. Whatever. I was disgusted and disturbed to high hell anyways, and wanted to get the fuck out of there. After returning home and getting my ass chewed out by my mom, I told her the truth after she asked me why I took her car. And I promptly blocked the guy and called my friends to tell them about the experience. Much to my surprise, Holly informed me about something she forgot to tell me about. Apparently, the guy had made several threats of shooting up his high school's graduation, and was very well known to the police. Although I thought this was over and done with, my junior year of high school I received threatening and grotesque phone calls, in which I reported to the police. Carter and Holly were also called and threatened. While mine were more of a sexual nature, theirs involved being called extremely specific slurs. Holly was black and Carter was gay. He even recited Holly's address. Although I never found out who did them, and there was a good chance Holly could have orchestrated the whole thing herself. I can't help but wonder if Kyle was behind them. So, to the foot fetishized guy who tried to get a minor to come back to his apartment and look at his knife collection, let's not meet ever again.